Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to Gen X CVA, the Strokecast, where a Generation X stroke survivor talks about rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand. And welcome to episode 2 of the Strokecast. This week, it's all in your head and new guidelines on TPA. First of all, I want to talk about the idea of this is all in your head. Now, normally when somebody says it's all in your head, what they're saying is that it's not real, or it's just psychosomatic, or it's just your brain is just creating something that is not an actual condition. In reality, though, when we consider the nature of stroke, all of our symptoms, and all of my symptoms in particular, they're all in my head. That's where the entire problem is. A lot of times the term is used derisively, but in the case of stroke, it's literally true, and there's nothing to be ashamed of in thinking that the problem is all in your head. A problem that is all in your head is not just a made-up one, and it's a term we really need to think about a little more carefully. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about what is a stroke. And obviously, most survivors are probably already familiar with this, but of course, not everybody who's listening is a stroke survivor. So the common medical term for a stroke is CVA. It stands for cerebrovascular accident. It means that there is something wrong with the circulatory system in the brain. There are primarily two types of strokes. One is called ischemic, and the other is hemorrhagic. Ischemic is the most common, and it's the type that I had. It is when a blood clot forms in the brain. That blood clot essentially forms a clog in one of the blood vessels inside the brain so that blood can't get past it for a certain amount of time. And when that happens, brain cells die. The other type is hemorrhagic. That's where instead of a clot forming in the brain, a blood vessel in the brain actually breaks open and spills blood outside of the circulatory system and into the brain tissue itself. The problem is that blood is essentially, it's kind of poison for the brain on contact. It does great in a well-flowing circulatory system where it can exchange oxygen and exchange nutrients with the nerve cells. But once that blood is outside of the circulatory system, just in and among those nerve cells, it's very bad for it. Remember, one of the ways that nerve cells work with one another is by sending transmissions across a gap between two nerve cells. That gap is called a synapse. And nerve cells communicate across that synapse by sending their signals, by releasing chemicals that get picked up by the other nerve cells. When suddenly that gap is filled with blood, instead of the neurochemicals and neurotransmitters that are supposed to be there, bad things happen. Regardless of which type it is, when the blood flow breaks down in the brain, neurons, nerve cells, die off progressively, and it actually gets worse as the stroke goes on. The problem that's happening with the stroke is literally in my head. The blood is no longer flowing the right way it's supposed to in there. The thing is, when most people see a stroke survivor, the way the stroke manifests is in things like partial paralysis, or trouble speaking, or trouble seeing, or balance, or walking, or all sorts of other different things that can happen. In my case, it manifests through weakness on my left side. The thing is, while I can't walk easily without my cane and my ankle brace, there is actually nothing wrong with my leg. And while I can't actually use my hand for anything, there is nothing actually wrong with my hand. And there is nothing wrong with my arm. It's all in my head. The problem is that my brain can't communicate well with my arm and with my leg. So the whole point of the rehab process and the recovery process from stroke is not so much about healing the arm or healing the leg. It's about teaching the brain to rebuild connections to those limbs. It's about the brain having to go ahead and route its messages around the dead tissue, about trying to bypass the mass of scar tissue in my brain that used to be nerve cells. It's about repurposing other neurons and building new connections among nerve cells and growing new nerve cells. Essentially, the whole recovery and rehab process is like what happens after a natural disaster, where all the power lines are out after a hurricane, and so you have power company personnel come in from all other parts of the country to help the afflicted area, to help string new power lines, to help get the communication lines up and running again. And different nerve cells in my brain are now being called upon to do other tasks, to help reestablish that connection between my brain and between my arm and between my leg. Because the breakdown, the problem, it is all in my head. That is literally where it is located. Now, of course, down the road, other problems can pop up with those limbs due to lack of use brought upon by the breakdown in communication caused by the stroke. Problems include shoulder subluxation, where suddenly the arm starts to gradually pull away from the shoulder itself. Hyperextension of the knee, where the knee starts bending further backwards than it should in an effort to maximize stability while walking. Muscles can atrophy from lack of use. Circulation issues can pop up, because when we don't use the muscles in those limbs as much, the blood doesn't flow as smoothly through those limbs. Falling becomes a bigger issue due to balance challenges. A stroke can also lead to a new sedentary lifestyle, where because it's hard to get up and move around and to do a lot of things, we end up sitting still a lot more often, and that can lead to its own health challenges. Changes in diet can result, whether they are medically mandated or whether those changes in diet are an outgrowth of other limitations of not being able to make our way around a kitchen as effectively, not being able to safely cook or prepare. And there are other deficits we can develop after a stroke that may make it harder to simply effectively feed ourselves on a regular basis and to manage a healthy diet. And as survivors and caregivers, we need to be diligent about these potential issues and to try and address them so they don't become long-term problems. Our broken brains already have enough to deal with in the repair process without picking up new ailments down the road. And that's going to be one of the ongoing challenges of stroke recovery. This is also one reason why sleep is so important. The brain consumes a lot of energy under normal conditions, but post-stroke it's consuming even more. It is spending a ton of energy and resources in the process of rebuilding those neural networks. Here's another way to think about it. Now imagine something that you are really good at, whether that's going to be talking to customers, writing software, operating heavy equipment, driving, playing a musical instrument, whatever it is you may do as an occupation or as a serious hobby. If you do it a lot, it's easy for you. Often you don't have to think about the details and the mechanics of it. You may even find yourself energized by doing that activity. But now consider what happens when you get pulled out of your area of expertise and assigned to a different responsibility. Maybe it's at work and the boss is shorthanded and assigns you to work in a completely different department in a completely different role doing something you don't know how to do well. And yet you still have to do it. Will you do it as well as the other stuff? Of course not. You're going to be clumsy at best, and it's going to be tiring. You're going to get exhausted a lot faster, and it's going to take a lot more energy. See, the same thing happens in your head post-stroke. After the stroke kills a bunch of brain cells that control, say, walking, other nerve cells get drafted into performing that function. They're not experts. They had other things to do. They are learning new behaviors. You're building new network connections in the brain. And those nerve cells are tired. And that's what's happening inside the head of a stroke survivor. So when it comes to these problems, they really are all in your head. The other thing I want to talk about today was the changes to the TPA Guidelines. Now, this is new guidance that's come out from the American Heart Association regarding stroke treatment. For many years, TPA was a medical intervention that could dissolve a clot in the brain if the stroke survivor was treated within 6 hours of the onset of symptoms. A patient who waited to go to the emergency room or who didn't get diagnosed in a prompt manner, or if the medication was not available at that hospital, would not be eligible for that treatment after 6 hours. Someone like me who wakes up with the symptoms would also not be eligible because my last known good time was more than 6 hours before I first observed the symptoms because, well, I was asleep. New guidelines, however, are actually allowing treatment up to 24 hours after symptoms first occur in certain circumstances. Mechanical clot removal is also available up to 24 hours. Now, of course, this also applies only to ischemic strokes, only to clot-based strokes, because these treatments are aimed at dissolving clots. This is not treatment that's available for anybody with a hemorrhagic stroke, because the last thing you want to do is impede clotting in that circumstance. Now, of course, I end up having, some mixed feelings about this. My only negative reactions come from the idea of, now you tell us. Because had this come out last summer, I might have a usable arm right now. In reality, though, aside from some minor sour grapes that are just sort of natural behavior, this is great news. It means that a lot more stroke survivors are going to be eligible for a medical intervention that can get treatment to break up their clots and minimize the damage from that stroke, minimize the loss of use of their limbs, the loss of use of other functions of the brain, minimize the risks of aphasia and other speech conditions, minimize the risks of swallowing conditions, and just minimize the risk of a lot of other problems that result from stroke. So this is going to be great news. And this is great news because stroke survivors are at higher risk for an additional stroke than the general population is. So this is great to see. We can look forward to more updates and innovations in the future. If you want to learn more about the changes to the guidelines, you can check out the American Heart Association's website, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes for episode 2 over at Strokecast.com. And that brings us to my hack of the week this week. Getting stuff out of the refrigerator can be surprisingly difficult. Due to balance issues, due to having only one working hand to be able to do it. What would happen is I would open the door, I would try to find something, then I would get hit in the head by the refrigerator door as it starts to close on its own. I would pull my head out of the way and then watch the door close. And then I would go ahead and repeat. And that would happen 4, 5, or 6 times, depending on what I was looking for in the fridge. And then I figured out the trick to it. What I do now is I open the vegetable drawer in the refrigerator, because once that vegetable drawer is open, it actually props open the refrigerator door. So now I can open the door, open the drawer, hunt for whatever it is I'm looking for in the back shelf, pull it out, then I can close the drawer and let the door close. So that's it for this week. If you have a story to share or something you'd like to hear about, go ahead and email me. I am bill@strokecast.com. Do you have any thoughts on this episode? Go ahead and let us know in the comments for episode 2 over at Strokecast.com. Be sure to subscribe to the Strokecast in your favorite podcast application. And as always, don't get best. Get better. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next week. To remind you that in this podcast, I provide general information and hopefully entertainment, but not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting with your personal doctor or medical team. Gen X CVA, the Strokecast, is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.